Hello guys, welcome to Redditor's Revenge. Here we post amazing revenge stories daily, and if you want more content like this, please subscribe to the channel and stay tuned with us. Moving on to today's first story. I 29F never had the best luck when it came to work or people. About 3 years ago, I immigrated to the US from Colombia, hoping to achieve the American dream and find good work. My parents did not approve at first, but eventually, they let me go. They couldn't come with me and they had to stay in Colombia. We didn't come from a lot of money, as both my mom and my dad were retired. My dad was a retired Army vet, while my mom was a school teacher. Life in Colombia was getting harder and harder and I could never find a good, stable job, so I was sure that the US would be a better opportunity for me. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I got to the US, I was met with a lot of ill treatment and racism. I lived in a Midwestern town and the people in my neighborhood were not very nice. I looked around for jobs all over the city, but since I didn't go to college in Colombia, and my English was not that great, I struggled to find a good job. I was almost broke and paying my savings in rent, until I found a job as a waitress. I absolutely hated it, but it got me by. I planned on going to community college when I had the time, so I could work on myself more and be able to get a good job, and finally, live the American dream. For a full year though, I was stuck in that diner doing nothing but taking people's rude comments, occasional flirting, and counting my tips to see what kind of dinner I'd have that night. It wasn't very good, but if I knew what would come after it, I would have never complained. I was only friends with my neighbor, who was also an immigrant from the Middle East. She had this idea that I would marry quickly, so I'd at least have someone to take care of the bills, while I have time to study and I wouldn't struggle so much. I refused at first since marriage wasn't really on my mind, but the thought kept growing on me the more ill treatment I experienced, and the worse things got for me financially. After getting an eviction notice twice, I was this close to dropping everything and going back to Colombia, and giving up my dream. All of this changed one night when a fancy-looking customer in a suit came into the diner and ordered a coffee at 1 a.m. He seemed to be some sort of businessman, as he was arguing on the phone over budgets and projects and seemed quite tense and angry. He yelled a lot and treated the other person on the phone quite harshly, but it seemed like there was some sort of problem happening. When he hung up, I gave him his coffee and joked with him about staying up so late, and that he might pop a vein if he was so angry. He smiled and laughed and actually came off quite charming. He told me that nobody had joked with him like this in years, as he was a big-time manager at some company, and everyone was afraid of him. I told him that he wasn't my boss, so I could joke with him however I liked. He seemed to really like that, and we had a conversation for a bit before he had to go. There was something about him that I found quite charming, even if he came off intense. I wanted to feel a kind of kindness beneath the intensity. I thought that I'd never see him again, but a couple of days later he came back and ordered the same thing at the same time. He told me that he didn't come back for the horrible coffee, but that he needed someone to joke with him again. He told me about the nature of his job and that he has to be that way for people to take him seriously. He seemed to genuinely enjoy coming over to the diner, and he even came in one day in the morning to have breakfast. As you might expect, things progressed and I remembered what my neighbor told me. When I told him about my story and how I immigrated here and the tough times I was having, he took it as a sign and proposed to me on the spot in the middle of the diner. Safe to say, I quit right there and then, and was finally excited to live the life I wanted. For the next 2 months, I was in heaven. He took time off from work, we got married, I moved into his big house in the suburbs, and we started enjoying life. I felt like Eliza Doolittle going from a flower girl or a waitress to a lady. I ate in fancy restaurants, wore nice clothes, bought expensive stuff, and most importantly, I felt like someone cared and appreciated me. When I told my parents, we all had a video call since they couldn't come over. My mom seemed very happy and liked him, but my dad was more reserved. When I asked him why he felt that way, he kept telling me that he didn't like my husband's eyes. He told me that he saw so many different people in the military, and he told me that my husband has the eyes of someone who treats his issues with violence. I told him that all of this was nonsense, but he wasn't convinced. He kept warning me about him several times. After those 2 months, when my husband got back to work, things changed a little bit. I was alone at home all day, which made me feel very lonely. My husband would come back very late at night and sometimes wouldn't come back home at all, so I was always alone. When he did come back, though, the stress of the job resumed, and he returned to that agitated and stressed state he was in when I first met him. One time, he got back from work and asked for dinner. I had made something simple and he got so mad that I messed something small up, that he got up, yelled at me, and threw the plate across the kitchen to the wall. I didn't know why he was like that and he became very, very picky. Another time, he didn't like the way I rearranged our bedroom, and he went on a 10-minute rant about how he didn't like unnecessary changes and that I didn't ask him. He was so intense in his yelling and every time, it made me cry and he never bothered to come and make it up to me later. I suspected that he may be suffering from OCD and I kept researching it. Literally, anytime something very small wasn't to his liking, he threw a fit and threw stuff around. I still thought that deep down he was a caring person and that this was all unintentional, but I was starting to believe that my dad may have been right. After things were tense for a little bit, we decided that we needed to fix things and we went about this the worst way possible. We had kids. We decided on having a kid and ended up having twins. The pregnancy and early months of the twins actually did do some good, and he calmed down a little bit and became more caring, but it only made things harder later. I had had enough of staying at home all day doing nothing, so I told him that I wanted to study to get my degree, and he refused. He was so adamant about it and he told me that since we now have children, I couldn't work and I have to take care of them all the time. It was a big argument, and he told me that he took me as a waitress so I should be grateful that I get to stay at home and be taken care of and that I will never work. He even threatened to divorce me and get another woman to take care of the kids if I decided to disobey him. This felt so extreme, and when I told my neighbor, she told me that it was customary for women in their country to stay home and take care of the kids, but that it wasn't okay for the man to be this rude and harsh. I kept trying to make excuses for him, but he didn't make things easier for me. After the twins were born, it was like he reached new levels of obsessive control. Anytime anything was different from how he wanted the kids to be, he got very aggressive. I could handle all the yelling, as I always thought that if someone yelled all the time, it was just their defense mechanism, and I knew that deep down he just wanted something to be a particular way. What I never expected, though, was violence. One day, he got home from work and I was in the kitchen with music playing. I couldn't hear the babies in the other room and apparently they were crying. All of a sudden, I saw my husband violently burst through the kitchen, yelling at me that the babies are crying loudly, and that I left them. We later found out that they were sick and had to take them to the doctor. That night when we got back from the hospital, he wasted no time and slapped me so hard across the face that I couldn't even process what was happening. I fell to the floor and he continued hitting me, shouting that I put the babies at risk while I was fooling around. When he was done, I had bruises all over my shoulder and I still couldn't believe that he did that. A part of me justified it by having already felt guilty about leaving the kids, but it was still completely unnecessary. I cried so hard that night that I woke up with a headache all the following day. I didn't want to even tell anyone, as I felt so bad and didn't want to bring it up. I had hoped that this was an extreme situation and I convinced myself that it would never happen again, but I was wrong. Since violence solved the issue that one time, it became a running theme. Another time, he got a call at home while he was resting and I took the phone to him, and he looked at me furiously before taking the phone and it seemed like he was arguing. When he got off the phone, he lashed out, telling me that he didn't want to take any calls, and that nobody knew that he was home, to begin with. I apologized and told him that I didn't know what he told people he worked with, and he got even angrier and pushed me down to the floor and I hit my lower back on the nightstand. I cried again and he just stormed off and went out. He seemed to be having a lot of problems at work, and it was clear from the number of arguments he was having. Every other day, he would go into a fight over the phone, and I was the one who paid the price of his anger. The kids were too young, so at least they never understood anything that was going on, but the way they cried when he yelled also broke my heart. He started developing a bad drinking habit to combat the stress he was going through, and when he got drunk, I avoided him like the plague. He always seemed to say the most hurtful words when he was drunk, and I could feel the way he looked down on me. Even when he was sober, he was practically treating me more like a maid than a wife at that point. I was just responsible for cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the babies, and if I messed up the smallest thing, he would beat me. I suffered through 6 months of domestic abuse like this, and I was too scared to tell anyone or to stand up to him. I didn't know what would happen to me or my kids, but I started living in fear day by day. I remember one time in his drunken state, he threatened that he would have me deported, and I became even more scared. I didn't know if going back to my country would be a better choice, but I knew that if I went back to my parents because of this, I'd never escape their judgment. Speaking of my parents, they paid me a huge surprise visit one day when they showed up literally out of nowhere on my doorstep, and told me that they came to visit, and wanted to make it a surprise. That day, I had a fight with my husband in the morning and of course, he hit me. I didn't look like I was in the best state at all, so I didn't welcome them as warmly as I should have. They both instantly deduced something was wrong and started interrogating. It was right before my husband was coming back from work, so we didn't have a lot of time to talk, as we were interrupted by my husband arriving. When he saw my parents, he acted surprised in a good way, but he was a terrible actor and I knew that he hated it, as it wasn't part of his plan. When he went up to change, though, my father noticed a bruise on my left arm and the fact that my eyes were red. He looked me sharply in the eyes and didn't say a word. His expression made me almost want to cry even more, and I didn't know what he would do. We had a good pretend dinner where everyone pretended to be friendly and welcoming, and I knew that everyone was counting down the minutes until it was over. After dessert, my father suddenly invited my husband out for a drink, which was strange as my dad never touched alcohol in his entire life. He kept insisting and they eventually went out. I talked to my mom at that time and told her everything, and she was just as shocked as anyone. She told me that I had to leave and go back to Colombia, but I told her that I couldn't leave the kids. Suddenly, we heard violent knocking on the door, and when I opened up, our next-door neighbor was holding my husband's bloody body and putting him on the couch. My husband could barely move and his face was doused with blood. We immediately called an ambulance and came to take him to the hospital. I arrived at the hospital alone, and in all the craziness, I had no idea where my mom even went. We went straight to the ER and the doctor told us that he was suffering from fractures all over his body and internal bleeding. I spent the whole night there with the kids until he stabilized, and a big part of me felt such joy to see him in such a state after all the pain he caused me. I called my mom and she told me that she and my dad had already gotten on their return flight. My dad sent me a very disturbing video, though, of him violently beating the living hell out of my husband. He recorded the whole thing, from blood splattering to legs getting broken. My dad was ex-military, so he knew exactly how to make him suffer. At the end of the video, I saw my dad holding my husband by the throat and making him swear that he would never hurt me again, and that he would divorce me. After he got out of the hospital, he made true to his promise. He seemed genuinely terrified. We got a divorce, and I started getting large sums of money as alimony checks. My dad told me that he did all of this for me, and to take care of the babies. I got custody of the kids, who would have to grow up without a father. I used the money to be able to attend an online university and even got my degree. A couple of years later, my kids had grown up a bit and I ventured into the business world and got a nice position in a company I'd never even dreamed of. I had no idea what happened to my husband, but talk around town said that he had to resign from his position, and nobody knew what he was doing afterward. Now, here is the end of our first story, and I hope you guys are enjoying my content. So before moving to the next story, you guys can share your thought in the comments section about OP's asshole husband, and the lesson OP's dad taught him by beating him to the pulp. I'd love to read your opinion. Also, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned with us for more revenge stories. Now, moving to our final story, in which a douche parks in a reserved handicap spot in front of our home and gets harassed by the entire neighborhood for doing so. He ends up having to sell his home at a significant loss. Now story. Sorry for making this long, but the context is pretty important. So my little sister, who is the sweetest girl in the world, is 12 years old but can't walk or communicate. Her mental age is around 6 months. She obviously cannot attend a regular school, but since we live in a big city, there is a wonderful school for kids like her. Even though we don't own a car, since we don't need one, we got the city to put up signs in front of our house designating a 4-meter spot for wheelchair pickup and drop off for her school bus every morning and afternoon. The signs went up perhaps 2 years ago, and after the first week we never really had any issues since most of our neighbors are wonderful and understanding of our designated spot. For some context, we live in a perhaps poorer community, though we're well off, but in our 9 years here, we've had nothing but great interactions with everyone here. Sadly, the neighborhood is gentrifying and we're getting more self-centered people with their Mercedes-Benz or Audi honking while my sister gets loaded onto her school bus, which takes around 4 minutes but blocks our little street, which pisses us off, as well as the other sane people that witness it. Naively, we thought this would be the extent of our unpleasant interactions. In September, we woke up like on any other Monday morning to find a shiny BMW parked in our disabled spot. It wasn't just partially in it, it was positioned perfectly to take up the entire spot. To make things worse, there were about a dozen open spots on the block, and it's not like they were all vacated that morning since we woke up at 6 a.m. We were baffled. I'd seen this car many times since last July, and it was the same car since there aren't many red sports cars in our neighborhood. It was usually parked about 20 meters south on our street, so we knew it belonged to a neighbor a few doors down. We did all the basics in this type of situation. We took a picture, took down the license plate, and called the police to report it. The cops came by within the hour and wrote a big fat ticket. I believe it was for $700, but don't quote me on it. Anyway, it was a significant amount. At around noon, a smug, angry guy came knocking on my door. I had the day off from school and was home on my own. It was obvious that it was the owner of the car, so I made a quick decision to record the conversation or screaming match on my phone. I opened the door, and before I could say a thing, the douche lays into me. I'm a 16-year-old girl, and he's in his mid-40s. Midlife crisis, maybe. He accuses me of all things, ranging from putting up those signs this morning to frame him to being racist. He was East Asian, I believe, but we have a diverse community. He goes on to say that disabled spots shouldn't even be a thing, that it's always empty, totally shooting himself in the foot based on his previous comments, that we should pay for his undeserved ticket, that it isn't even an inconvenience since the spot next to his was free and my sister could just get on the bus from there. Blah blah blah. Once he finished, I said okay, and shut the door on his furious face. He rang the doorbell another 5 times before storming off. To my satisfaction, the recording caught everything fairly clearly. In the evening, I told my parents what had happened and gave my dad a copy of the recording. We have a pretty tight-knit community, and there is a neighborhood Facebook group with around 3,000 members. My dad decided to post a summary of what had happened along with the recording and a picture of the car in our spot on the page. There was immediate uproar with people saying they would fight back or whatever. We were humbled by the feeling that our community was standing up for us, but we didn't think anything would come of it. The next day, I leave the house to go to school and walk by the guy's car back in his normal spot, and notice that the front right tire was deflated. Upon closer inspection, it was slashed. As I said, our community is tight-knit, but I can't say I expected anything like this to happen. The guy must have seen the Facebook post because he didn't come back to our house to complain or accuse us of anything. The following weeks were sweet. Whenever I saw him in public, people would go up to him and remind him that he was a shitty human being, a bit harsh in my opinion, but they weren't my words. In November, his house had a for sale sign in the window. The housing market had also gone by a bit. I'm always kind of curious about how much houses similar to ours are selling for compared to how much we paid for ours in 2011, so I knew what he paid for it in July. Once I saw the for sale sign, I rushed home and checked the local house listings, and lo and behold, he was selling for $90,000 less than what it was going for in July. He wanted to get out of our neighborhood. While his crime wasn't nearly worth $90,000, I must say that I don't feel bad. Worst case scenario, he sells that obnoxious car of his, which would easily cover the lost money. Let's just say that we haven't had a single car parked in my sister's spot since. Now, here is the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know your opinion. What do you think? What OP and her community did is right or wrong? So before leaving, please hit the like button and do subscribe to the channel to stay tuned with us for more awesome stories.